Today we are very fortunate to have Bruce Epperly speaking on one of his favorite subjects and one about which he is quite an expert. Among other things, Bruce, I think I'll describe Bruce as a traveler. He has traveled different places, but that's not the reason I call him a traveler. Bruce is someone who has always sought to bring the insights of process philosophy and theology into the everyday, ordinary world. And he's done this in many ways. He's done it as a writer, he's done it as a lecturer, workshop leader, and professor, and pastor. So he is a person of many talents. And today he's speaking to us on one of those talents, out of one of those areas of specialization. At the moment, he's theologian in residence at Westmoreland Congregational United Church of Christ, and he's a professor in theology and spirituality at Wesley Theological Seminary. So he's concentrated in the DC area. Before that, he was concentrated in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Over the past 45 years, you can read this for yourself. He's been doing the things that I've already described. He's ordained in the United Church of Christ and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And I think it's important for you to recognize how active he's been as a writer. He's a person who converts his ideas to writing largely because he wants them to spread, and largely because he thinks that they have something to offer to the way people live their lives and the way they understand human life and planetary life. So some of the books that he's written are Process Theology, A Guide for the Perplexed, Saving Progressive Christianity to Save the Planet, A New Pentecost for Progressive Christians, and Homegrown Mystics, Recovering the Soul of Our Nation Through the Healing Wisdom of America's Mystics. Now, among other things, he has written a trilogy of books that are especially relevant to what he's talking about today. His trilogy includes The God of the Growing Edge, and his subtitle there is Whitehead and Thurman on Spirituality and Social Change. The second book is Prophetic Healing, Howard Thurman's Vision of Contemplative Activism. And the third one, The Work of Christians, The 12 Days of Christmas with Howard Thurman. And now the fourth one that he has going is The Wisdom of Howard Thurman for Just Such a Time as Now. And this will come out in 2026. Bruce, we're so lucky to have you. Thank you so much for coming, and we're in your hands.
Well, it's a delight to be here today. And, you know, I grew up in the Salinas Valley, and also as a preteen, we moved to San Jose, California. And in San Jose, if you're familiar with that area, there's a place called the Winchester Mystery House. Has anyone ever heard of the Winchester Mystery House? Apparently, Ms. Winchester, whose husband was the creator of the Winchester rifle, received a prophecy from a spiritualist saying to her that as long as the hammers kept hammering in her house, she'd live forever. And if you go to San Jose, it used to be out in the middle of the country. Now it's in the middle of the urban area. I kind of feel that way about books. I think as long as I'm writing books, I'll probably stay alive. You know, and of course, Mary Elizabeth and I are classmates. And again, I'm a lesser mortal than Mary Elizabeth, but certainly I was grateful to have learned from her. And of course, I have to give homage to the good ancestor, Alan Moore, who is just a beautiful man who had a really good influence on my wife, Kate Epperly, Catherine Gould Epperly, and who really thought the world of Alan. And he was dean at Claremont for a while at the School of Theology, and made it feel like a place that was home. So I have to give homage to the good ancestor there. And of course, to John Cobb and David Griffin. I was in Chautauqua Institution in New York last week on holiday, and one of Anne Jacque's, David's wife's friends, was there too. So we had a few minutes to reminisce about David and his compendious spirit. And of course, John is a model to us who are now in our second or third act, I guess, as they say, now in our third act, that we may be doing wonderful things for 10 or 20 more years and still be hopefully giving wisdom at 99. You know, I'm grateful for John and David and Bernie Loomer, who are my 3 primary process teachers at Claremont, and certainly, you know, they live on as good ancestors in me, and I try to live up to their creativity. Well, Howard Thurman we'll talk about today, and we'll talk about him somewhat ambiently, and I'll try to make a few connections with process thought and with Whitehead on the way. Thurman once wrote a couple books about Negro spirituals. His Deep River and the Negro Spiritual speaks about life and death, along with James Cohen's The Spirituals and the Blues, are among 3 of my favorite books. And one of the songs he talks about, the spirituals he talks about, is Deep River, my home is on the other side. I don't do it like Paul Robeson. Deep River, Lord, I want to cross on to the campground. He was always looking for the deep river of God, a God you can believe in. There's a lot of gods you can't believe in, but he spoke about a God you can believe in, a God who is on the side of justice, a God who sides with the poor, who challenges the oppressor, and yet does a remarkable thing of seeking healing for those who perpetuate injustice. In my mind, he is the apostle of prophetic healing, where you can be a prophet and a healer at the same time, who spoke of a God whose waters quench our spiritual thirsts and refresh our passion to become God's companions in healing the world. Well, it was 1972 and 1973 were kind of watershed years for me. It was toward the tail end of the Vietnam War. I'd been drafted in the last group of people drafted for Vietnam, and I was conscientious objector doing alternative service. And I was also a junior in college. I was able to work and go to college at the same time. And it was in 1972 and 73 that I discovered Whitehead, Howard Thurman, Plato, Teilhard Chardin, all in the same year. And they've stuck with me for over 50 years now. I was so enamored of Whitehead that in 75, I drove down to Claremont to study at the grad school and School of Theology, and I've never turned back. You're not going to turn back once you've found process theology. And they have shaped my life. They have shaped my life. And I want to tell a story to set the stage. This is a story that's never been in print. It's a story from Howard Thurman. I've looked all over his writings. I've never seen it in print. I got it from my wife, Kate, who is the only wife I have, but got it from Kate, who was at a Disciplined Order of Christ retreat with Howard Thurman, probably a couple years before she met me, so it must have been about 1976 or 7. And Thurman tells this story. It's a summer day, not unlike the day in Washington, D.C., hot summer day. And he's a young boy who goes out berry picking in the woods behind the house, putting as many berries in his mouth as he puts in his pail. And he goes further and further and further out into the woods until he hears a boom of thunder and sees lightning flash across the sky. And he has this realization, and perhaps it's happened to you. He doesn't know where he is. He does not know where he is. And of course, many of us, when we don't know where we are, we start moving faster, even though we don't know where we're going. And he's tempted to do that, the fight or flight. But he remembers something his grandmother, Nancy Ambrose, told him. Whenever you don't know where you are, stop. Pause and look around. And so he does. And he looks to the right, where there's a flash of lightning, to the left, backward and forward, until he sees something familiar. And pausing and noticing all the way through, he discovers that the storm leads him home. There is a still point and wisdom in the storm. I was overhearing Kate talking to some people about Howard Thurman the other day, and he had a big influence on both Kate and I, because two of our mentors were among his best friends. Sure, if you read his book, With Head and Heart, and I commend it to you, he mentions two white men. One of them is named Shorty Collins. They called him Shorty. Those were the days when they described people by their characteristics, their physical characteristics. We don't typically do that anymore. Shorty was 6'6", so that's why they called him Shorty. And he was my mentor. He was my draft counselor. He was the person who was a pastor, the Baptist College chaplain, retired but still working, just like some of us are doing. And he invited Howard Thurman down to our church when I met him for the first time in 1972 or 3. One of Kate's mentors was Alan Armstrong Hunter. And he is was a pastor. Did you know him, Neil? He lived in Pilgrim Place, but he was the pastor of North Hollywood Congregational Church for many years. And Kate heard that story at this retreat up in Santa Barbara, I believe, of the Disciplined Order of Christ. And she related a story about Thurman. He got up to the stage just like I did. And his first words were, God. And he let the silence resound. Well, Thurman, like Whitehead, began his theological reflections with lived experience, with the concreteness of life in all its wondrous beauty. And like Whitehead, he ventured into the heavens. He ventured into the heavens and then went back to earth, to the concreteness of daily life. In terms of the externals, Thurman was born in 1899 in Daytona Beach, Florida. Died in 1981 in San Francisco. He grew up in the Jim Crow South, a time of fear and trembling, a time of white nationalism which just doesn't seem to go away, a time of the lynching tree, a time in which people living in Daytona Beach, Florida, probably felt on a daily basis the way some of our undocumented residents feel each day in this time of desperation in which the forces, at least in my mind, the forces of oppression are out there and frightening. He went to Morehouse College and then Colgate Rochester Divinity School, and much to my embarrassment, he was not engaged or not allowed to attend Andover Newton, the UCC Divinity School, because at the time in the 1920s, they did not admit African Americans, Black persons, to school. After finishing at Colgate Rochester, he had a pastorate in Oberlin, Ohio, and then studied Rufus Jones, the great Quaker teacher. And it's interesting, for those of you who are interested in Rufus Jones, Clarence White, I don't know if any of you know Clarence White. Has just written a very short book on process theology and Rufus Jones. And Rufus Jones was one of the great Quaker mystics. You can get it for $4 on Amazon. He prices the books so there's no profit whatsoever to him. He then went from there to become a professor at Morehouse College, Atlanta, then dean of chapel and professor at Howard University, and then called to the West Coast to be the founder of the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples, which was the first intentionally multiracial church in North America. But then took another journey back to Boston University as the first dean of any African-American dean of any primarily white institution. He was dean of Marsh Chapel there and also professor, where later Mary Elizabeth Moore became the dean of Boston University Theological School. He was a professor there. He was a cosmopolitan person, but his cosmos always touched earth with being a Black American living in the United States. He was went to the heavens and then down to earth. Although he was not a typical activist, he wouldn't be compared to somebody like Martin Luther King or William Barber today of the Moral Mondays. He was an inspiration to the civil rights movement. Probably wrote the first Black liberation theology, Jesus and the Disinherited. Martin Luther King says of him, "I do not believe that I could have faced the challenges of our struggle for civil rights without the spiritual resources provided by Howard Thurman." And Thurman and King apparently carried Thurman's Jesus and Disinherited in his satchel during the civil rights marches. Well, as I said, I had the opportunity and was blessed to have the opportunity to meet Howard Thurman twice. First, when I was a junior at San Jose State University in California, and he was invited to speak at a dinner at our church, Grace Baptist Church. I had just returned to church. I was a recovering evangelical, recovering conservative Christian. A year or two before, I learned transcendental meditation and then returned to the church after learning transcendental meditation. That's an interesting route, but it brought me back to the church. It was a progressive, spirited Baptist church. Thurman was invited to speak, and he so enthralled me that I went to the campus library, the library at San Jose State, and either checked out all of his books that were there or borrowed someone from Shorty Collins. At graduate school, I met him again when he spoke and gave a lecture probably in 1976 at Scripps College. And he's always been a companion of mine. He's always been someone who's walked with me. I don't know if you have people who've walked with you, who've been your intellectual or spiritual companions. And some of you perhaps are. I always reach for Bob Messel's books. When I'm thinking about some process theology, I always look at Bob's book, and I want to give a shout out to Bob there, and his work on process thought is among the best you'll ever find. I'm always happy when my books end up on the same shelf as Bob's. when somebody says, oh, you ought to read Bob Messel, and then there's sort of an afterthought, they mention me. But there are certain books and people that just go with you your whole life long. Now, I'm going to talk about Thurman's viewpoints by looking at 7 moments in his life. 7 moments in his life, because sometimes if you're insightful enough, what happens to you becomes a source of wisdom, right? It becomes the source of wisdom that shapes who you are. I'm going to share these as a way of introducing his thought to you, or looking at it from a slightly different perspective than others might. The first was his childhood. I think it's Wordsworth, and I know it's Wordsworth, who says that every child comes to earth trailing clouds of glory. And Thurman came trailing clouds of glory. He was a cradle mystic. He was a cradle mystic. As a young child, he talks about being part of the lung of the universe. He talks about feeling the sea winds entering his body. He had a particular tree, and I'm going to describe this from his words, that he had a special relationship with. And think about that for you. Did you ever have, or do you still have, a place that might be described by the Celts as a thin place, a place where heaven and earth join? Lori, I can sense that you have one of those. Yes, I see you. Hallelujah, right? If you've got one. But from the very beginning, he had a tree. And this feeds into the upcoming program on Wild Church, which is indeed a movement I commend you to come and listen to. Quoting Thurman, I could sit with my back against its trunk and feel the same peace that would come to me at night. I could reach down in the quiet places of my spirit, take out my bruises and joys, unfold them, and talk about them with the tree. I could talk aloud to that oak tree and know that I was understood. It too was part of my reality. Like the woods, the night, and the pounding surf, my earliest companions giving me space. Thurman was a mystic. Thurman was a spirit person. It came with who he was. Deep down, he was meditating before he knew he was meditating. He was praying before he knew he was praying. He perceived the movements of God everywhere. As an old hymn says, you can hear God in the rustling grass. God speaks to me everywhere. He, from the very beginning, had that sort of process relational, experiential, pan-experiential vision. Again, if you want to capture a recent essay by Jay McDaniel that really speaks to this, it's his one on global epistemology that he wrote about. There are many voices, and God comes to you in many voices. The second moment was reading with his grandmother. Now, his grandmother, many of us who are grandparents have read with our grandchildren, right? Some of you even talk about it on Facebook. Some of us have even moved closer to grandchildren, and they've caused us to uproot our lives. Thurman reversed the course. He read to his grandmother, Nancy Ambrose. She was an enslaved woman who never learned to read or write well. It's not clear that I'm not sure she was illiterate, but she was a very wise woman, but she did not have the wherewithal to want to read the Bible. And one of the things she didn't want to ever read was the Apostle Paul. She didn't want to read the Apostle Paul because several times a year, the owners of enslaved people would come and preach sermons. You know what passage they preached, right? Slaves, obey your master. And she couldn't stomach Paul in the slightest as a result of that. However, she talks about a counter message. She and her companions living in enslavement would often steal away to Jesus. And the enslaved preacher would say something like this: "You are not slaves, you are God's children." Today, we might translate this in this time, troubled time in the United States, to some of our friends in our neighborhood. I know they're here in Potomac, Maryland is a town a lot like Claremont in some ways, but there are a lot of undocumented residents who work taking care of our lawns and houses, right? He would say, "You are not an undocumented person, you are a child of God." Regardless of what Kristi Noem or Donald Trump say, those are the bad preachers. Those are the bad preachers. You are a child of God. And there's nothing they can say that can contradict that. From his grandmother, and his grandmother was a wise woman. She was a grandmother in the great tradition of grandmothers. She learned that Jesus means justice. Jesus means justice. A lot of people have forgotten that, haven't they? You know, Thurman makes a comment. It's a very telling comment in one of his writings. When I encounter a Christian, white Christian, I never know what their attitude toward me will be. Isn't that a terrible indictment? They never got the memo. They will know we are Christians by our love, I guess. They never got that memo. From his grandmother, he learned that Jesus means justice, that God is on the side of transformation and resistance. In his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, he makes some comments that a lot of us can read the Bible for years and never think about. That Jesus was a Jew who lived in an oppressed society and never experienced one moment of freedom in his life, and could be abused by the Roman oppressor at the drop of a hat. That Jesus, that God means that you never are satisfied with the status quo. He didn't talk about God with the same metaphysical intricacies that Whitehead did, but he made absolutely clear that God did not baptize the unjust status quo, that God is a God that moves forward, that the moral and spiritual arcs of history are God-breathed, that God doesn't look back, that God doesn't celebrate an order that's unlawful, that God moves us forward. A living God is constantly moving forward. A living God is not the source of everything. And that's an important thing. We know this as process people, right? God is not the source of injustice. That's an important affirmation, isn't it? God did not, God bless Donald Trump, but God did not move that bullet over a millimeter so Trump could make America great again in that type of greatness. That goes against the moral arc of history, Thurman would say. A third moment is Sam Cromartie's sermon. You know, churches can be the most wonderful places in the world, and they can be awful petty, right? How many of you have experienced the church as a wonderful, self-sacrificial, graceful place, besides me? How many of you ever experienced as a petty place, where where a mustard seed would be larger than any theology or compassion you'd find in it? Well, when Howard Thurman's father, Saul, was an agnostic. He worked on the trains. He worked on the railroad trains, which was a place where a lot of black men worked in those days, in the teens and 20s of the 20th century. He passed away fairly young. But when he passed away, because he was an agnostic, the Baptist preacher where his family attended, and the church where his family attended, would not bury him, would not perform his funeral. Who's going to perform the funeral? They finally found a traveling evangelist named Sam Cromartie to perform the funeral. And Sam Cromartie preached him into hell during the funeral because he was an agnostic. And at that moment, Thurman said, I will have nothing to do with the church anymore. Obviously, he changed course later. But having said that, as a more mature Thurman, he became a universalist of grace. You know, some of us learn our theology because of the pain we experience, right? You know, I think of that great book by Rebecca Parker and Rita Nakashima, Proverbs from Ashes. I've used that as a textbook more than once. I suspect a few of you have too, where you learn good theology by experiencing bad theology. You know God couldn't possibly be that way. And you either get rid of God altogether, fire God, as James Baldwin says in one of his writings, or you find out, as Whitehead says in Adventures of Idea, what a God could be, a truly living, open and relational, loving God. He became a spiritual universalist. And certainly at the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples, and here we're talking in 1950s, before the vast movements of Asians to the United States and Asian religions, they had people come in from all religions. It was a Christian church associated with, I believe, the Presbyterians, but it was welcoming to all religions, which I believe is where a healthy church goes, to be honest. A fourth movement. Again, there are sometimes we learn our theology young, and Thurman's not even in college yet, and he's learning his theology as a child. That's where I learned a bit of my theology, was a child, both the good and the ill. He's probably 12 or 13 years old, and he was hired by a local white businessman to rake leaves. And he's raking leaves, and I don't know if any of you here, if when you see a pile of leaves, just wants to kick them over. Has anybody ever done that? Steve's done that. You've done that, Steve. You know what it's like. You know, they're just begging. When I see leaves on the side of the road in Potomac, Maryland, you know, I'm tempted to walk right through them, because that's just what you do. There was a young girl who was the daughter of this business person, and every time that he had a pile of leaves, she'd start looking at them, and then she'd kick them over. And finally, Howard got irritated with her and said, you know, if you do that anymore, I'm going to tell your father. These were the days of hat pins. I remember my mother had a hat pin. I haven't seen one for 40 or 50 years at least. She had a hat pin, and he stuck him in the arm, and he made a squeal. Have you ever been stuck in the arm and just, ouch? You know, and she says to him, Howard, what's going on? You can't feel. Howard, you can't feel. And the later Howard Thurman became like Whitehead, the philosopher, the theologian of feelings. If you can't feel, then you're not entitled to any ethical consideration, right? If the non-human world can't feel, it's not entitled to ethical consideration. If children in Gaza can't feel, they're not entitled to ethical consideration. If somebody at Home Depot who's picked up by ICE can't feel, they're obviously all thugs, they can't feel, then they don't deserve our ethical consideration. And Thurman became, in many ways, the theologian of feeling, not unlike Whitehead. Everything can feel, and whatever can feel deserves our ethical consideration. Yes, yes. As small children, we're sometimes told our feelings don't matter. And of course, we're fortunate in the processive world, Neil, to have a theology, a philosophy that talks about how important experience is, how important feeling is, that prehensions or feelings are the heart of the universe, right? Whitehead says, as does Thurman, you can feel. Even the people we don't like can feel, which gives us a certain degree of compassion toward those folks, even if we have trouble liking them. A fifth experience was at the railroad station. When Howard Thurman is a rising high school student, I have one grandson who's starting high school at Winston Churchill High School in Bethesda, Maryland in September. There were only 3 schools in Florida that admitted Black students. None in Daytona Beach. He would have to go away to school. And so on the day he was going away to school, he comes to the railroad station with his big trunk. You know those big steamer trunks? And he was pulling it along with a belt. He gets to the ticket master. The ticket master says to him, you can't bring that onto the train. You have to store it in the baggage cart, and it's going to cost you money. Thurman didn't have any more money. He couldn't get on the train. His dreams of going to school were shattered. He sits down on the side of the road and starts crying. Suddenly he looks up and sees the face of a working man with a denim hat and overalls. And he says, what the hell are you crying for? And Thurman explains his situation. And his man says, well, if you need to go to school, the least I can do is help you. So he marches him out to the ticket master, pulls out some money from the rawhide pocket, the little bag he has, and pays his way. Thurman dedicates his autobiography to the stranger in the railroad station in Daytona Beach who restored my broken dreams 65 years ago. He never saw him again. He paid it and went on his way. Thurman was the theologian of small encounters. You know, the Jewish mysticism says that the world is saved one life at a time. If you save a soul, you save the world. If you destroy a soul, it's as if you destroy the world. I think the world is probably saved one action at a time. One action at a time, not just one life. That each of our actions is important. Each of our actions matters and has, to use Whiteheadian language, has some immortality to bring the world closer and closer, hopefully, to the divine aim. Each moment. It was reminded me as I was pondering this of a comment from Dorothy Day. You know, you all know Dorothy Day. And she lamented the fact that in her 70s, she could no longer get arrested. She couldn't go to protests anymore. Her health had deteriorated. But she said, at least I can pray. At least I can pray. The smallest actions, we know this in process thought, the smallest actions can move the world forward or backward, open to more divine possibilities or fewer divine possibilities. We make a difference. The 6th day of these 7th is President Hope. President Hope was the president of Morehouse College. Yes, we tend to limit the power of prayer. And of course, at process theology, we don't think of prayer as being supernatural, as violating the laws of nature, but prayer as working within the laws of nature, opening to new possibilities, and maybe adding to the energy of God in the universe. President Hope was the president of Morehouse College when Thurman attended. And every sermon or talk he gave, he referred to the students at Morehouse as gentlemen. Gentlemen. And Thurman says that that word gentleman was a balm in Gilead to him. In a time in which Jim Crow reigned and people could be arrested and lynched for the slightest provocation, were called names, just being called gentlemen restored their spirits. Have you ever heard a word that helped you and brought you forth, transformed your life for the good? It doesn't have to be much, does it? One of the saints of Claremont that probably a couple of us encountered, Nell Morton. Nell Morton used to say, we're heard into speech. We're listened into speech. And she's one of the good ancestors too. We're heard into speech. And when I came upon this, I don't know about you as a reader, but sometimes I can read something several times and all of a sudden it touches me. I realize that people like me who are privileged in all sorts of ways need to be reminded about the language we use to the people who work in our homes, who we check out our groceries from, who work in our townhouse community where I live in Potomac. So I took it as a personal discipline to call all the men working there, sir, even if they're younger than me, and try to use an appropriate term of respect for women, ma'am, or just simply acknowledge them. In a world in which people, they're mostly people of color, they're almost all Latino or Latina in my neighborhood who work at things, for remembering the dignity. Remembering dignity. I mean, people like me have to have that burden, don't we? We have to have the burden of respect and dignity. And when they heard the word gentleman, all of a sudden words like thug, all of a sudden words that are derogatory melted away. Finally, Thurman goes to India in a group in the 1930s, and he's attacked by one of the people there saying, how on earth can you be a Christian? How on earth can you be a Christian living in the United States in the 1930s? And Thurman notes in that regard back to him, I make a careful distinction between Christianity and the religion of Jesus. My judgment about slavery and racial prejudice relative to Christianity is far more devastating than yours could ever be. From my investigation and study, the religion of Jesus has projected a creative solution to the pressing problem of survival for the minority of which he was a part in the Greco-Roman world. In words that would be echoed by Whitehead, actually Whitehead wrote these words maybe a few years earlier, the church has often chose Caesar when it should have chosen Jesus. It has followed the idolatry of making God like a potentate and the sanctioner of the status quo rather than the source of freedom. I'm going to bring it home with just a few comments about Whitehead and Thurman, where they fit together. The first is they both proclaim the universality of experience. We live in a living universe. We live in a living universe. Second, the universality of value. Whatever experience is a locus of value and deserves ethical consideration. Third, they were apostles of adventure. I often use the term holy adventure, and I discovered one year, once upon a time, that the place I probably got it unconsciously was from Thurman. In one of his books, he said, and perhaps a holy adventure. And I never realized that till years and years of using it, and I came upon it, and I said, somehow or other, this must have been embedded in my psyche in such a way that Thurman and I were joined together, and he shaped me. Finally, they were fierce critics of Christianity as a arbiter of the status quo. We all know, if we've studied process and theology, of Whitehead's comment that Caesar conquered when the Western world accepted Christianity. Caesar conquered, and we can certainly see the conquest of Caesar these days in the United States, where the love of power seems to have overcome the power of love, when some of our Christian brothers and sisters, siblings, seem to believe that hard-heartedness and incivility is much more like God than love and kindness and affirmation. A similar comment from Thurman: when the world is not finished yet, the world is not finished yet that people do worship God, yes, and they obey the gods they worship. But the gods they worship are unworthy gods. The tragedy of life is that persons become like the gods they worship. These are not atheists. Persons become like the gods they worship. If they are bad persons, it means they're worshiping bad gods. When I first came upon that passage, I was reminded of that passage in Religion in the Making, where Whitehead says religion evolves from the God you're fearful of, the transactional God, to the God of goodness who you seek to imitate. Well, what Thurman can offer us in more than one ways, and we can unpack this, is that he's calling us each in our own way to become contemplative activists. You know, Thurman is a model. Oftentimes the progressive church is criticized for putting social action ahead of theology and letting the cart be in front of the horse. Thurman had a holistic viewpoint. His theology, his understanding of the Bible, his spirituality guided his ethics and guided his social concern. He becomes a model of how to do theology rooted in faith. And that was why I think he was so powerful as an inspiration for people like King. So I want to close and open to conversation with just a comment, a poem from Thurman that many of you know. Look well to the growing edge. All around us, worlds are dying and new worlds are being born. All around us, life is dying and life is being born. The fruit ripens on the tree. The roots are silently at work in the darkness of the earth, against a time when there shall be new leaves, fresh blossoms, green fruit. Such is the growing edge. It is the extra breath from the exhausted lung, the one more thing to try when all else has failed, the upward reach of life when weariness closes in upon all endeavor. The basis of hope in moments of despair, the incentive to carry on when the times are out of joint and people have lost their reason, the source of confidence when worlds crash and dreams whiten into ash. The birth of a child, life's most dramatic answer to death. This is the growing edge incarnate. Look well to the growing edge. Thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you so very much, Bruce. And I think